All right. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today, Heather Nagy and Joel Ben. Both of them are members of the NFLT acquisitions team. Heather Nagy has been with NFLT for 4 years and currently serves as the Strategic Conservation Planning Coordinator. In this role, Heather conducts Geographic Information System, or GIS, analyses to determine high priority conservation areas within NFLT's working region. She also works with NFLT's conservation partners at the local and landscape level to assist them with identifying and achieving their conservation goals. Currently, Heather is leading the development of the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative Florida State Implementation Team, which works to protect and restore salt marsh and marsh migration corridors along Florida's Atlantic coast. And we'll be hearing lots more about SASMI in this presentation today. Heather earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Florida, her Master of Environmental Management degree from Duke University, and has received a graduate certificate in GIS. And we have Joel Ben, originally from South Florida. Joel has lived and worked in and around Lake Okeechobee prior to attending law school at the University of Florida. Upon graduating from UF, he transitioned to the legal sector, where he worked for a private insurance defense firm and eventually the St. Johns River Water Management District's Office of General Counsel. Joel's experience working with and on Florida's landscapes, in addition to his time spent with the St. Johns River Water Management District, sharpened his focus toward playing a more active role in conservation acquisitions, and Joel's legal expertise is a huge asset to us at NFLT. So with that, thank you, Heather. Thank you, Joel, for joining us today. And I believe Joel's going to kick us off, so I'll turn it over to you.
All right, Abby, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Members, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen and enjoy this presentation that Heather and I have put together. And with that, we're going to get underway. And at first, I think I just wanted to kind of go over some basics about NFLT, and you'll see how those are relevant with the work that we're doing in the salt marsh arena. And so, as I'm sure many of you know, NFLT was founded in 1999 with a mission to preserve and enhance our quality of life by protecting North Florida's irreplaceable natural environment. You know, we envision North Floridians can feel more connected to and have a stronger appreciation for our unique native environment. And you'll hear more about how unique it is throughout the course of this presentation. The North Florida Land Trust implements collaborative approaches for long-term solutions commensurate with rapid growth. And you'll hear about some of those partnerships throughout the course of this presentation. And finally, by protecting more of North Florida's farms, forests, and natural areas, we maintain traditions, enhance lives, and sustain our expanding communities. So our core focus areas range from Nassau County in North Florida all the way down to Volusia County and further west towards the I-75 corridor and even beyond. Total North Florida Land Trust has protected approximately 41,000 acres, and in the last 3 years have closed on 13,666 acres alone. This is a task we take seriously, and I'm very fortunate and proud to be a part of that process. So land conservation, that's going to be something you're going to hear a lot about today. And we've got different tools that help us affect that kind of conservation. You see the 4 pieces of the puzzle that help fill out our acquisitions mission. And I'm just going to briefly go over those tools. So we've got land purchase. That's, everybody kind of understands that one. That's NFLT using its own funds to help preserve property by buying it outright from a willing landowner. Of course, NFLT accepts land donations. A willing landowner who is interested in seeing their piece of property preserved may donate it to NFLT as a 501c3 nonprofit. We also help facilitate transactions between willing landowners and our partners at the local, state, and federal governmental levels, whether that be county, Nassau County, for example, the state, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, or even the federal government through myriad federal agencies and the armed services. And of course, one of our most powerful tools in our tool belt is the conservation easement. And for a quick overview on those, conservation easements are a willing landowner selling away its development rights to a particular piece of property to the land trust to ensure that that property remains in its natural condition in perpetuity. And, again, I think our mission is so important because of all these nature's benefits you see on this slide. And you'll see how all of these really retain and are important in the salt marsh environment as well. Buffers from storms and flooding, restoring and preserving natural habitat, agriculture and aquaculture, protecting our water supply, conserving wildlife, and providing recreational opportunities. Conservation allows us to protect so many of nature's benefits and those services that nature provides to us, even in ways we may not consider on the front end. So let's talk about salt marsh. That's what we're here for today. What is a salt marsh? Well, salt marshes are coastal wetlands that are flooded and, I'm sorry, guys, there we go, that are flooded and drained by salt water and brought in by tides. Now, marshes are marshy because the soil may be composed of deep mud and peat. Peat is made of decomposing matter that's often several feet thick. It's waterlogged, root-filled, and very spongy. Because salt marshes are frequently submerged by the tides and contain a lot of decomposing plant material, oxygen levels in the peat can be extremely low. This is a condition called hypoxia. It's caused by the growth of bacteria, which produce the less than fun sulfurous rotten egg smell that's often associated with marshes and mud flats. So the other half of our presentation today, climate resiliency. What does climate resiliency mean? Climate resilience is the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and respond to hazardous events, trends, or disturbances related to the climate. Climate resilience efforts take many shapes and sizes, but the goal is to help prepare communities for both acute events, like a hurricane, and chronic events, like sea level rise. Salt marsh environments function to provide resilient solutions to both acute and chronic events. So salt marshes protect our coasts. They are important for coastal economies and resilience. Might be news to you, but certainly news to me. NOAA anticipates that $7,200 per acre annually are protected from storm surge and flooding by salt marshes. They decrease wave energy, absorb flood waters, improve water quality, and even sequester and store carbon. So during storms, salt marshes absorb floodwaters and wave energy, decreasing property damage in adjacent communities by up to 20%, according to NOAA. 1 acre of salt marsh, 1 acre, can absorb up to 1.5 million gallons of floodwater. For reference, we just had the Olympics in Paris. That's 2.25 Olympic-sized swimming pools, all stored by 1 acre of salt marsh. Salt marshes are rich in biodiversity. They provide great habitat for a variety of birds, the eastern black rail, salt marsh sparrow, wood stork, and a host of others. Salt marshes and their estuaries support habitat for more than 75% of the commercial and recreational fish species in the United States, including some you might be familiar with. If you're familiar with salt marshes, like the redfish, the red drum, blue crab, white shrimp, and flounder. So seafood that we eat commonly in the United States all spend some portion of its life in salt marsh environments. We need salt marshes to continue to enjoy our food sources. And also, salt marshes are culturally significant. They're sacred to the Gullah Geechee Nation, who inhabit coastal lands from Jacksonville, North Carolina, to Jacksonville, Florida. Historically, Native American nations used salt marshes like the Seminole, Goali, and Yamasee, all for nourishment, materials, and cultural sites. Salt marshes were also historically used for rice cultivation, plantation owners in the South Carolina area and further south. A little more on the Gullah Geechee Nation. These habitats provide food to them, like we discussed, whether it be some kind of aquaculture, fish, shrimp, oysters, clams, crabs. But it's also where daily staples were grown, rice, vegetables, things of that sort. And of note, as you'll hear a little bit more later, the Gullah Geechee are a partner with the North Florida Land Trust in SASMI, whose goal is to promote and preserve salt marsh habitat in the region. And you'll hear more about SASMI later in this presentation. I did want to point out one thing, the picture here to the right on this slide. During another SASMI event, during a beachcomb, this artifact from a Gullah Geechee Nation was found. And, just one example of the cultural significance of salt marshes to, those populations here in Florida that call them home. And, you've heard a little bit about, but I'd like to continue. Salt marshes are under threat. NOAA estimates that the U.S. loses approximately 80,000 of acres of coastal wetlands and salt marsh annually. Red and black mangroves, a hallmark of salt marsh environment, have been discovered as far north as Cumberland Island, Georgia, indicating increases in temperature, allowing for the trees to survive further north than they had been previously be able to, and competing with other salt marsh species that can be found, that far north. And so, as salt marshes are threatened, we've noticed what's called salt marsh migration, which is the process by which salt marshes move inland to higher ground as sea levels rise. And without underdeveloped corridors for marshes to migrate inland, they'll drown and be lost. And as we discussed earlier in this slide, the protection that salt marsh environments provide to coastal communities can't be understated. And seeing them migrate or be drowned out and lost is a net negative all around. So how do we make salt marsh and resiliency a priority? Here at the North Florida Land Trust, we have 6 priority preservation areas. These are strategic prioritizations of lands with high conservation benefit and impact. And if you're familiar with NFLT, you may already be familiar with some of these priority preservation areas. But they include community conservation, springs, aquifer recharge and water quality improvement, working lands, military base buffering, the Osceola to Ocala wildlife corridor, and coastal salt marsh habitat. So I want to say thank you all for listening to my little primer on salt marsh and climate resiliency. And at this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my wonderful colleague, who you've already been introduced to, Heather Nagy, who's going to tell you a little bit more in detail about what NFLT is doing in this space. Heather?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Joel. Yeah, thank you. That was some amazing information that Joel just provided, and that really gives you a view of all of the benefits that salt marshes provide, but also the fact that they face multiple threats, and that's why they are one of the priority conservation areas for NFLT. And conserving salt marsh properties is not something that is new for NFLT. In total, we've protected just under 6,000 acres of salt marsh This includes 18 properties across 3 different counties, Nassau, Duval, and St. Johns. About 385 of those acres are NFLT's conservation easements. A little over 1,000 are NFLT owned properties, and we've transferred a little over 3,000 acres to the state's Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP, or the National Park Service. And because this is a priority preservation area for NFLT, we continue to seek out and protect properties that contain salt marsh. Additionally, we're also working to protect those marsh migration corridors so that we can prevent future marsh loss from sea level rise. And so I'm going to highlight a couple of key salt marsh properties that NFLT has helped to protect over the last couple of years. So if you can go to the next slide. So the first I'm going to highlight is Little Tiger Island. This is a really amazing property that's located in Nassau County, right along the Florida-Georgia border. It has a very significant location between several other protected areas, including Fort Clinch and Cumberland Island, and it's also in very close proximity to Naval Submarine Base Kings Bay. So next slide. And so as you'll see from this map that pops up of Little Tiger Island, it is in very close proximity to Fort Clinch. And in fact, it now further expands the park's boundary. Its acquisition has protected the park's viewshed, which is one of its most recognizable assets. And additionally, this acquisition also touched on our military base buffering priority preservation area, as this acquisition helped to protect national security. The Naval Submarine Base Kings Bay's ballistic missile nuclear submarine fleet travels through the St. Mary's River to access the Atlantic Ocean. The St. Mary's River has to be dredged regularly in order to allow for that submarine passage. So conservation is a really important priority for the area to reduce siltation and ensure that there are no adverse effects to water quality. So the property itself is about 585 acres, of which 415 of those acres are salt marshes, and about 170 acres are upland, and a portion of that contains maritime forest. This property closed in February 22nd of 2023 for a purchase price of $1.96 million. And NFLT facilitated its purchase to the state through the Florida Forever program. And this property contains critical habitat for both coastal and migratory bird species. It provides habitat for 12 federally listed and candidate species, as well as 8 state-listed species, including the piping plover and the West Indian manatee. Piping plovers use the shorelines of Little Tiger Island as foraging habitat. And also other important bird species that have been found on the property include the roseate spoonbill, the black skimmer, and the American oyster catcher. So next slide. The next property I'm going to highlight is a recent NFLT acquisition that's located in Duval County, the Bull Family Preserve. Next slide. This property is 219 acres and is now an NFLT fee-owned property. This transaction also closed last year, February 1st of 2023. And this was a really special acquisition because the Bull family was very passionate about conserving this property. They are the family of Harcourt Bull, who was the first mayor of Atlantic Beach. NFLT dedicated the property on Earth Day last year, April 22nd of 2023, along with the Bull family. The family had owned the land since 1949, and they wanted to ensure that it was kept in its natural state forever. So this property is primarily salt marsh and has a few small areas of hardwood forest. The salt marsh and tidal creeks provide habitat for wildlife, including the federally endangered West Indian manatee, also the federally threatened wood stork. There's also an abundance of wading birds on the property, including great blue herons, brown pelicans, and cormorants. And in addition to the wildlife this property protects, the salt marshes will also help to prevent flooding, so that coastal resilience we were talking about, flooding to neighboring communities, reducing storm surge, and also removing nutrients from the water to help that ensure it remains clean. And finally, the Bull Family Preserve is an excellent addition to several other protected lands in the area, including the state's Castaway Island Preserve, the city of Jacksonville's Dutton Island Preserve, and NFLT's conservation easement, the River Branch Preserve, which is located just on the other side of the bridge, just north of the property. So next slide. And the last property I'm going to talk about is an NFLT facilitated transaction that's located in St. Augustine called Fish Island. And some of you may be familiar with this property. Next slide. Fish Island is a really beautiful property with a very interesting history. It was officially acquired in November of 2019 by the state of Florida for $6.5 million. The property is approximately 57 acres. About 23 of those are salt marsh and 50 acres of upland. And NFLT had facilitated the purchase to the state as part of the Florida Forever program. It was located within the Northeast Florida Blue Wave Florida Forever project area. And so in addition to our work actually facilitating the transaction and working with the landowner, NFLT had held a fundraising campaign to match state funds with private donations to assist with that acquisition. And additionally, the city of St. Augustine has agreed to manage the property as a public park. So this is now a park that you can go and visit and see this property for yourself. And it contains marsh grass that will help with flood protection for St. Augustine and its neighboring communities downriver. It also has a healthy maritime hammock forest, and preservation will now help avoid water quality impacts to the Matanzas River. And for some of the history of this island, which I found really interesting, is that Fish Island was the first orange grove in Florida. Jesse Fish, who the property was named after, came from New York to St. Augustine in 1736. And at that time, the property was a plantation with approximately 3,000 orange trees on the island. And Mr. Fish was considered Florida's first orange baron. The park has also been listed on the National Register of Historic Places since 1972. There is archaeological evidence of 4,000-year-old artifacts, as well as historical evidence pointing to the likelihood of unmarked 18th century burial sites of enslaved West Africans and Protestants who could not be buried in Catholic cemeteries. And there's still some traces of the historic structures scattered throughout the property, like some building rubble, there's a portion of a chimney, and footing of a structure of what may have been a boathouse. And so protecting this property was really important, not only for the salt marsh ecosystem, but also protecting that important piece of St. Augustine history. So next slide. And so as that Fish Island acquisition really beautifully displayed, NFLT can't do this work alone. We have many partners at the local, state, and federal level who we work with on acquisition projects. And when it comes to conserving salt marsh in particular, or working on coastal resiliency efforts, we have several organizations and partnerships that we regularly turn to partner on those types of projects. So some of you may be familiar with the Nassau Clam Program. That's the Conservation Land Acquisition and Management Program. And this is Nassau County's locally funded land acquisition program, which NFLT helped them develop over the last several years. And NFLT is now able to partner with Nassau County to help them acquire parcels that are important to the county. And many of those properties contain salt marsh or salt marsh migration corridors. And similar to the clams, St. Johns County has their LAMP program, which is a land acquisition and management program. And this again allows the county to protect locally significant properties. As a partner, NFLT is able to match those county funds with state, federal, or private funds to help accelerate those conservation efforts. And NFLT recently contracted with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the Florida DEP on a $6 million grant to acquire salt marsh properties that are located within the Northeast Florida Blue Wave Florida Forever program area, which is located in both Duval and St. Johns counties. And so this grant is a really important that is going to allow us to protect many of those remaining salt marsh properties that are in that Florida Forever project area. NFLT is also part of several technical advisory committees and working groups that are facilitated by the Guana-Talamado-Matanzas National Estuarine Research Reserve, or the GTM-NER. Active research and monitoring is performed at the GTM-NER by staff scientists and visiting investigators from all around the world. And this research conducted at the NER helps in implementing best management and restoration practices relating to coastal and estuarine ecosystems. And it also helps our staff here at NFLT with conducting more science-backed and technologically advanced conservation planning. And finally, a really important initiative that you'll have heard about already a little bit is the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative. So next slide. So SASMI is a regional conservation initiative with the goal of conserving and restoring 1 million acres of salt marshes within the South Atlantic to ensure their long-term survival. And this initiative ranges from North Carolina through Brevard County here in Florida. The initiative began in 2021, and since that time, it has grown significantly to include over 300 diverse partners that span federal, state, and local agencies, other nonprofit organizations, cultural groups, recreational groups, and landowners. And SASMI developed a 10-year regional plan to conserve and restore South Atlantic salt marshes. And then that is entitled Marsh Forward, a regional plan for the future of the South Atlantic's million-acre salt marsh ecosystem. So you can go to the next slide. So again, NFLT has been very involved with SASMI since it began in 2021. Last year, we completed an initial conservation planning and outreach report for the state of Florida, and that was based off of feedback and research that we conducted during stakeholder meetings with many diverse groups, including scientists from the GTM-NER, members of the Gullah Geechee Nation, local fishing clubs, state and county agency staff, as well as local resiliency officers. And now we are building upon that effort by creating a formal SASMI state implementation team, which is going to work to implement that regional Marsh Forward SASMI plan here in Florida. And this team is going to allow SASMI partners to maximize collective efforts and work towards shared goals. And we actually have a workshop coming up this Friday with about 30 actively engaged partners from Northeast Florida. We're going to come together and begin developing a state action plan of projects that will help to protect and restore salt marsh. So you can go to the next slide. And one last project that I wanted to highlight is that NFLT worked closely with Florida DEP to develop an entirely new Florida Forever project area. This project is called the Atlantic to Okefenokee Florida Forever project area, and it's located in Nassau County right along the St. Mary's River. And this project is significant for salt marsh because it contains many properties that either have salt marsh or those marsh migration corridors. And starting in 2025, any property that's located within this project area is now going to be eligible for state funding, which is going to greatly accelerate protection of the properties where there is a willing landowner. So next slide. And so hopefully you have learned something new today about either salt marshes or climate resiliency. And if you'd like to learn even more, or maybe even volunteer, get involved with some of these efforts yourself, there are a lot of different opportunities to do so. There's opportunities to volunteer on salt marsh restoration projects through the FWC, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission's Aquatic Habitat Volunteer Program. Volunteers from that program have helped to replant marshes and lagoon areas, created and monitored artificial oyster reefs, and monitored the health of seagrasses. CCA Florida, which is the Coastal Conservation Association, has many opportunities to help with coastal cleanups, planting seagrasses, and many other coastal projects. So an important tool in our restoration toolbox for salt marshes is a living shoreline. And the Resilient Florida program has a lot of information about living shorelines, something either that can be done on your property or just to know about in general for your city or county. There's many examples on their website with examples of successful projects that have happened throughout the state of Florida. And more information about our work with SASMI at both the state and regional level, along with that SASMI plan that I mentioned, are available on their website at marshforward.org. And finally, land acquisition will allow us to protect those remaining areas of salt marsh and also preserve those really critical marsh migration corridors. So if you're interested in conserving a coastal property, you can also always reach out to our staff here at NFLT or submit a property via our website for potential conservation. So next slide. So we really thank you all so much for attending today. Here's our contact information for both Joel and myself if you want to reach out to us, and we are happy to answer any questions you might have.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Heather and Joel. This has been incredibly insightful. What I didn't mention to the members is that we're going to have a quiz on all these acronyms because wow, there are so many. I'm impressed that you guys can keep them all straight. I haven't seen any questions in the chat yet, but we do have plenty of time. So feel free to shoot some questions into that chat, or if you want to use the raise hand feature, that is also an option, and that can be a signal to me to unmute anyone who would like to ask a question. While you guys are thinking of those, again, I'll just say thank you to Heather and Joel. Save the date again for our next Working Lunch Wednesday, which will be on October the 9th with our land manager. There we go. Mark Manning. He'll be talking to us about prescribed burn and why prescribed burn is a great tool for NFLT and other partners to use. Don't be shy. Ask away. There we go,
have a
Brenda.
question. The question is, are there any prospective properties underway of conserving this year, and where are they located?
So I can speak to that a little bit. I am our lead with our acquisition program, partnering with NOAA and FDEP. And currently, that acquisition you heard about was we've got a contract and a grant to spend about $6 million to preserve salt marsh in St. Johns and Duval County. And to that end, we're currently looking at a large tract in St. Johns County. It's called the Deltona Shores parcel, and hoping to get some good news on that front. In addition to that piece, there's another parcel in St. Augustine in the intracoastal. We referred to it as Poncho Creek, and that's about 22 acres of combined wetlands, uplands, and salt marsh there in the intracoastal in St. Augustine. And we're working with a willing landowner, and hopefully we have good news from that perspective as we move forward here. But those are two big projects coming down the pipe, and we're doing our best to make sure those are closed as timely as we can to kind of enact this goal here to preserve salt marsh and help protect long-term climate resilience projects.
Okay, we have another question. Are there any flora or fauna you monitor in the marshes?
There's not any that we monitor here at NFLT that I know of, but I know there is a lot of that work that is done at the GTMNR. Many of the research scientists there are conducting studies on specific species. They do a lot of work with water quality, looking at invertebrate species and how they can impact water quality. There's also some really interesting work being done looking at what they call the transitional zone. So those areas that transition from salt marsh and kind of come inland and start to turn into forests, and the impacts that is having on species that live there, whether it's either salt marsh coming in or looking at that marsh migration process. So there's definitely a lot of really interesting research that's being done, and we certainly at NFLT keep that in consideration with our projects or properties that we own. And we are doing some species monitoring inland, and that's definitely something I think we may consider in the future doing on our salt marsh properties is looking at what types of species we have there.
All right, next question. Have there been any collaboration with City of Jacksonville or other cities to help buy chronic flooding residential properties and turn these properties back to marshland?
So we do partner with municipalities where it's appropriate and where we can. Certainly, the city of Jacksonville is one of those partners that we've worked with in the past. Regarding specific residential properties that are chronically flooding, I couldn't tell you right now that is a project we currently have in-house, but anything is possible. And if the details line up and it's something that helps improve the environment and help us meet our priority preservation areas and their goals, we will certainly consider.
Yeah, and I will say we did help initially with the McCoy's Creek Restoration Project, which is being done in downtown St. Aug or downtown Jacksonville. And we did help them acquire some of those properties that actually are being used now as part of the restoration of McCoy's Creek, and as well as areas where they're now installing recreational areas. So that is just certainly something, the municipalities do reach out to us, and where it's appropriate, we do help out with things like that.
Great. Another question. How does the dredging of the port area of the St. Johns River affect the salt marshes in the area?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I know there's actually a lot of studies being done with something called beneficial use of dredge materials. They're actually can take that material that's dredged out of areas like the St. Johns River and actually use it in other areas to actually help build up marsh and to assist with that marsh migration process, where maybe there's too steep of a slope for marshes to migrate inland. They can actually use that material and assist with that process. But I don't know specifically the impacts on those marshes right there. I know that's certainly taken into consideration with all of the dredging being done by the Army Corps and other organizations. But yeah, they're definitely trying to beneficially use that material for other places where they can.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions. So if we are feeling good and ready to go, I will give you a few minutes back in your day, everybody. Thank you again, Heather and Joel. Thank you to Rick and Faith Hoffman for being our generous sponsors for this wonderful series. And thank you to our members for joining us today. We hope you'll join us again next month. I did also want to do a shameless plug that we did a really fun member event this summer at the Bull family property that Heather discussed. So we did a little kayak tour of the salt marsh there at the Bull family property. So that was a really fun event. We saw some roseate spoonbills, which was really, really neat. As well as some other birds and other wildlife. So that's something we'll be looking to repeat in 2025. So stay tuned. But thank you all for being here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this rainy Wednesday. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.